Hello and welcome to another episode of Beach Perspective. It is important in the gamut of news and information that we're dealing with. It is important to sort of set the record straight on certain issues. The first of which is some of the reporting that has happened on the India-Pakistan conflict, and we've seen consistently that there's a certain lens that reporters, the so-called established reporters, have used against India and what has been, and not just against India, but to just view the whole dynamic between India and Pakistan. And I think one particular claim came from the Western media, CNN. It is no surprise that there is a section within the United States that does not like established media like CNN and others. Now, while the old school media have continue to have their relevance in the sense of in the age of social media, but I think the onus on cross-checking, vetting, and removing some of their own biases while reporting is important. And this particular view came to light in how Nick Robertson of CNN described the events leading up to the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. It is important to sort of shed some light there on the biased reporting that we've seen in CNN. It is important also because, as facts stand, um, the idea that there's been a list that India has put out of the terrorists that were associated with specific madrasas that were targeted and specific places that were targeted in the first series of attacks that India carried out against very calculated and calibrated attacks that India carried out in specific locations that were harboring terrorists. Now, there's a list. Some of them, some of the names that India that of the terrorists that India took out have been out there. They're there to be verified. Now, you won't see the media mostly talking about it because obviously that doesn't suit certain purposes. The second is the idea that a reporter from CNN would call what was an outright domination uh, in terms of escalatory cycle between India and Pakistan over the past few days, but particularly just before the ceasefire, when you saw, uh, at least 11 Pakistani Air Force bases being lit up by Indian strikes. None of that has really figured in the reporting, and in fact, the ceasefire, the outcome of the ceasefire is now based on Pakistani retaliation. Right? I mean, it's a vicious cycle to go in for a scholar or for any scholar in terms of what reporting and reportage should look like, because it's clearly a job of journalists. But I think it is important for scholars to intervene in terms of looking as a subject of study. And I think it's going to be important also from the point of view of strategic studies as to how um, this conflict unfolded, how it actually unraveled, and how ceasefire was achieved. So I think it's important from an academic perspective, and from the perspective of escalatory dominance. Now, that escalation dominance may not have been sustained, and it's very difficult to sustain that escalation dominance vis-a-vis nuclear powers, particularly when you're when the country when the enemy country is also a nuclear power, and there are very few dynamics like that out in the world. So I think it becomes a testing ground in terms of how this should be achieved. Now, having said that, um, a, the amount of evidence that India has in through this series of events that have unfolded is really out there, and I think it would be wise for the Indian government in time to actually show some of these international journalists, arrange a visit, give more information, if possible, to see that all the claims about strikes and counter strikes and how they stand. I think that needs to be verified, and actually that will be a feedback for journalists themselves. And I think particularly the narrative war uh, that also unfolded parallelly while this combat was going on in the air, land, and sea. Um, I think that it's important. It's a new battlefield that has opened up in combats today, and I think it's important to set that narrative as well. It is, I most of us acknowledge that there has been false reporting from both sides, and there's been some jingoism that has sort of fueled this idea online in terms of how one perceives the and that's perceives the war unfolding, and that's obviously impacted by the nature of outcome that everyone desires, and that's the bias that creeps in. But I think um, the fact that most of the international reportage actually, particularly in the West, have ignored and have latched on to the Pakistani media, have ignored the idea that there was an escalation dominance just before the ceasefire that India had achieved, but particularly lighting up the 10, 11 Pakistani Air Force bases, something that has never happened in the past. And I think it's important for journalists to factor this, particularly when they're reporting. And it all it also the, it also depends. Your perceptions are. It's understandable that perceptions are sometimes moderated by the place you are in, and I think that is where the challenge of journalists should be. That even if they are in a particular country at that point, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't actually impact their views. Let me stop there on this issue and come back with something important in the next episode. Thank you.